thank you very much for that warm welcome. I'd like to begin by thanking you for coming to the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and the state of Nebraska. Some of you are coming from much better weather, so we appreciate your willingness to take on some cold and appreciate the change of seasons. I myself was just in Mexico yesterday, so I'm adjusting as well. I'd like to first, thank Bill and his staff for putting this symposium on and for taking advantage of the opportunity to get such a fantastic group of institutions together to think about issues of diversity and inclusion, which have assumed such prominence across the higher education enterprise, particularly in the last couple of months and over the last couple of years as well. So thanks, Bill. Thanks for all your efforts. And thanks to you as an organization for taking this on as well. One of the things I'm always talking about, and as I try to advance diversity and inclusion at the University of Nebraska, is that everybody has to be involved. This isn't something you can delegate. Every person on campus, every organization on campus, every administrator, every faculty member, every student, every staff member has a role in diversity and inclusion. So it's really encouraging to see a group like this, that you're busy enough with the performing arts, but to take on diversity and inclusion, I think is a real credit and something that I would hope other major organizations will embrace as well. So let me make sure I'm... So Bill asked me to come here and talk about diversity and inclusion at the University of Nebraska. So I'm going to spend about 10 minutes trying to contextualize it. Diversity and inclusion is not the same at every campus, not the same at every geographic location. And so I want to spend some time telling you about what diversity and inclusion means in the state of Nebraska. It's my opinion, so don't attribute it to anybody but me. I'm not a historian, but I'm going to make a lot of historical claims. That's administrative prerogative. So just a little bit about myself, because I am part of that context too. As Bill said, I joined the University of Nebraska in 1996 as an assistant professor of electrical and computer engineering, which is it's quite a bit away from diversity and inclusion. I'm a geek, proud of it. But my story is somewhat representative of the story of Nebraska. So I grew up right outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. Spent my whole life there in a very diverse and inclusive culture. I spent a lot of time in the district and where you could eat at a restaurant from anywhere in the world, where you saw people of every shape, color, everything. But my father was born in western Nebraska in a town called Trenton, which is, and this was a big joke in my family, it's near McCook. So that's how you know where Trenton, Nebraska is. And he grew up, as you might guess from my last name, my grandfather was Mexican, wound up settling in western Nebraska because he worked on the Transcontinental Railroad. Didn't get married until he was 63 years old, had 10 kids. My father was the second of those. They lived in a tiny two-room house, really grew up in poverty, but their house would get flooded every couple of years when the Republican River flooded, because it was before the Army Corps of Engineers came in. So they'd rebuild this little two-room house. And my father, when he was growing up, trying to go to school, had to fight his way to go into school. As the first boy in the family, the local community wasn't very welcoming. And he literally had to fight his way into school until they finally realized that he was a great athlete. And then they started welcoming him into school. So my father, then set that path for the rest of his siblings. I promise I won't give you my entire life story. The key is I grew up with that context. I was lucky my parents, even though they did not get the chance to go to college, were committed to higher education. So I have 4 siblings. We've all got college degrees. 4 out of the 5 of us have advanced degrees. And then, the irony that I would come back and wind up as the dean of the College of Engineering at the University of Nebraska, a generation later, is amazing, right? It tells this amazing story of the power of education. It tells this amazing story of of how education transforms perspectives on issues of diversity and inclusion, and why we as a university have to continue to lead that within the state. So I've been here for 20 years, still very active as a faculty member, still run a research lab, but I've also been both as an individual and as an administrator very involved in issues of diversity and inclusion on campus. And I'll finish my biography by saying I'm currently chairing the Chancellor's Diversity Council, and we're trying to work to develop a real plan for advancing diversity and inclusion on our campus. So enough about me. A little bit of context about the state of Nebraska. So, Nebraska became a state in 1867. And at that time, there was a population, a little bit before that time, the population of the state could be measured in a few thousands. Nobody was living here. It was very sparsely populated. But over the next 20 to 30 years, this is one of those historical claims I'm making here. There are facts behind it. The population of the state grew to several hundred thousand. And that was driven really by three things. It was driven by the Homestead Act. It was driven by the Transcontinental Railroad. That's how my grandfather wound up here. And it was also driven by the end of the Civil War and the fact that when Nebraska was entered as a state, it was required, unlike the northern states, the existing northern states, to ban slavery. Right? So there was actually a migration of former slaves and freed African Americans who migrated to the state of Nebraska because of that promise. So we found, so Nebraska found itself in the late 1890s to 1900, actually a very diverse state in the context of what the population of the United States was, and that's illustrated on this graph where you see we have all of Central and Western Europe represented here. And it still persists in the state. If you drive around, you'll see the cities that have Czech, German, and other names from Central and Western Europe. Those groups are still very organized. There's a Czech organization in the state, a German organization, and a Polish organization. So there actually is this strong tradition of diversity in the state. And if you were somebody who immigrated to Nebraska in the 1890s, people really didn't care what you looked like as long as you could survive, because it was a very tough environment. Homesteading, living in a sod house, or these things they call dugouts, where they literally dug a hole in the ground and put a roof over it and called it a home. If you survived that, you were accepted into the community because there was such a shared sense of the difficulty of life, beautifully captured in some of Willa Cather's works as well. So there is this really strong tradition of diversity in the state, unlike some of the states on the East Coast where I grew up, quite frankly. There's also this strong egalitarian sense that, if you're hardworking, if you're honest, all these things, you're welcome in our community. But things have changed, obviously. Most of us would not look at this graph now and say we're a very diverse state, right? So things are complicated in the state of Nebraska as we move now to modern times by a couple of things. So the first is we have an amendment to our state constitution. So Article 1, Section 30. So we were one of many states that in the 2000s passed a constitutional amendment by referendum that said, essentially, you can't create any programs that advantage any particular race, sexual orientation, gender, ethnicity, that uses public funds. University of Nebraska is a public university with a substantial public budget, so we are bound by this constitutional amendment. This complicates things when you're trying to look at the issues of diversity and inclusion. And so I think we all grasp the intellectual complexity that this presents, that how do you advance diversity and inclusion when you have a state and a state budget that says you can't have targeted programs. For me, the more interesting issue actually though, and the issue we're wrestling with, is how this impacts how you run a university. And in particular, it means how do you balance issues of compliance with issues of advocacy. So we have a very good Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance that is about compliance, not just with our constitutional amendment, but also compliance with all federal regulations from Section 504, Title IX, Title VI, all those types of things. And they do a really great job at what they do. But what is the job of an Office of Compliance? Quite frankly, it's to keep you compliant, right? and so it is inherently and appropriately conservative in the sense of, not in the political sense, but in the sense of its ability to advocate. It is trying to protect the university and the university community from significant harm that can happen if you fall out of compliance. So it's not a criticism, but they have a particular role. And it's exacerbated by this amendment. So we're constantly struggling with, and an argument I'm constantly making with the university senior leadership is, we have to separate compliance and advocacy. We understand the role that compliance plays on the campus, and that's important. We don't want the university to get investigated by the Office of Civil Rights. We don't want our budget cut from the state because the legislature says we're not being compliant with the constitutional amendment. But we also need a strong advocacy office that is really pushing, seeing just how flexible this amendment is, how flexible all state and federal regulation is, how flexible the campus is, and how creative we can be at advancing diversity and inclusion without violating compliance. And there's a healthy natural tension between those two things. All right. So we have the compliance office, we don't yet have the advocacy office, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But this is one of the complicating factors in Nebraska as we look at issues of diversity and inclusion. A second issue has been the changing demographics of the state. So back in the 1800s, we had this very diverse European population, and that remained fairly constant for roughly 100 years. And then, some time ago, roughly 20 years ago, we started to see a significant change in the demographics of the state. Any idea what that change was? That makes sense. So all that traditional population, their population growth essentially went to zero. All right. But we had a huge influx of Hispanics, Latinos, and Latinos, right? Driven a lot by the meatpacking industry and migratory work around agriculture. And this has been very interesting in the state. So I have up on this map of the city of Schuyler. So a small town about an hour away from Lincoln. That was this very traditional Nebraska town 20 years ago. Roughly 20 years ago, its Hispanic population was 4%. In 2000, its Hispanic population was 25%. Right now, I think its population is approaching 50. Its Hispanic population and Latino population is approaching 50%. So on the one hand, this is this amazing transformation. It's driven a lot of economic growth in the city. But it also, as you might imagine, the people who have lived in that town for 100 years, for generations, are struggling with that kind of change. That's not gradual change. That is sudden and significant change. And so when we talk about diversity and inclusion at the campus and in the state, we also have to take into account the fact that these communities like Schuyler, but it also applies to Lincoln and Omaha and the university, are really undergoing a rapid change that our state hasn't seen before. So even though we have this wonderful tradition around diversity that goes back to when the state was founded, it's been very complicated by the rapid change in our demographics that we've seen in the last couple of years, and quite frankly, the demographic change that will continue to happen. The other thing that's complicated our conversations around diversity and inclusion. It's not just about race and ethnicity anymore. That original slide, it's all about what country you came from. But as we all know, issues of diversity and inclusion are much more complicated now. It's complicated by religion, both the diversity of religions that we have, and then also the increased number of population who would say they're not religious, right? So that's a very interesting dynamic when you talk about diversity and inclusion. We have a fairly strong tradition around, and progressive tradition around lesbian and gay people on our campus. That we have a great center that serves that community. There's a long tradition of it. But now as you know, that was L, B, and G, right? Now as we start adding more letters to that, and now we're getting into, as we start talking about gender identification and things like that, but you know, that's blowing the minds of some Nebraskans. It's because, again, it's pretty dramatic change from what they're used to, even though we have a tradition around lesbian and gay colleagues. You know, so all the other dimensions, when we look at, you know, we have an amazing success story that's nationwide, but it's playing out in Nebraska, that we have, because of all the investments that have been made in the K through 12 system on educating people with disabilities and people with mental illness, we're having increased populations both in our increased number of students and faculty who are disabled or with some form of mental illness who are showing up on our campus. It's a tremendous success, right? Something we're proud of. But boy, does it present challenges as you try to start thinking about accommodation, when you start looking at 100-year-old buildings, when you look at what happens when you have a graduate student who gets stressed out at the end of the semester and goes off their medications and is now both a risk to themselves and potentially a risk to others. So, you know, so the landscape of diversity and inclusion, as you all know, is much more complex than it was a couple of decades ago. And that's, you know, that's what we're really wrestling with at the University of Nebraska is, okay, how do you work on all those different questions? You know, how do you create a community that it's not just welcoming to different races and ethnicity? You know, that's a challenge unto itself. But then to all these other issues, you know, and all these other people who are coming here to be part of our community, expect and should be welcomed, and whose success we're invested in. You know, how do you enact that? I wish I could give you the answer, but I don't have the answer to that. So where are we now? Bill mentioned not here, not now, not ever. So this was a rally that was organized by the Office of Student Affairs at UNL in the fall of 2013 in response to a series of events on incidents on campus involving racial slurs, right? So use of the N-word, and the N-word written on chalk on the sidewalk in front of fraternities, a few other things, some cyber bullying, using apps I don't understand. So, you know, so our Office of Student Affairs, very well intended, created this Not Here, Not Now, Not Ever initiative, and had a big rally. Over 500 people showed up. There was really great dialogue. But then nothing happened after that. So rather than being an initiative, it was an event. And that was indicative of how we responded to issues of diversity and inclusion for a long time. Is when something happened, we reacted. We reacted, I think, well and full of good intention, but there was never any follow-through because our thinking hadn't yet progressed beyond the fact that, well, everybody knows diversity and inclusion is important. Right? We hadn't made it explicit that we have to work at diversity and inclusion. So we had this event, and the communities on campus to whom it was directed most are underrepresented minority groups. About a month afterwards, started coming back to the administration and saying, well, what are you going to do? We're tired of rallies. We're tired of speeches. You know, what are you actually going to do that we can hold you accountable for to advance diversity and inclusion? Well, so based on that, the following fall, the fall of 2014, the Chancellor created the Diversity Council. And that's where I started becoming formally involved in these activities. And the idea behind the Diversity Council was that it would have representation from the major organizational units on campus, student affairs, academic affairs, business and finance, and the Chancellor's office, and then it would try to coordinate efforts around diversity and inclusion. And this is where the compliance issue came back to us, that the Chancellor's representative was supposed to be the head of our Office of Institutional Equity and Compliance. This was when Title IX was changed. And it became pretty clear that there was no capacity in that office to lead a diversity council while trying to take care of Title IX, Title VI issues and all those compliance issues. So also nationally, this was about the time when you start to see a change on the role of chief diversity officers. So, in the last decade, there was something like 100 universities that created the role of the chief diversity officer on their campus. They enacted it in many, many different ways. I'll paint two extremes to illustrate the point. One was you went out, you found somebody, typically a faculty member, who had some history or credibility on issues of diversity and inclusion, and you said, you're going to be our chief diversity officer. We give you a title, we give you an office, then we say, go do it. All right? And then there were other institutions who said, okay, this needs to be integrated into the core of who we are. It needs to be part of our strategic planning process. There needs to be accountability measures associated with it. You need an office that's properly resourced. Well, in 1994, when we were doing our diversity council, a lot of universities started eliminating their CDO positions. And it was largely the first case where they had found one person, given them a title, but not resourced them either financially or with staff, not integrated them into the core functions of the university. So I took this opportunity to go to our chancellor at the time, Dr Perotti, and say, if you expect the diversity council to come back and tell you to appoint a chief diversity officer, tell me now, because I'm going to step down as chair of the diversity council, because I know that won't work. And I know that's the logical next step for the way the University of Nebraska has been enacting diversity and inclusion. That's what you're going to do. And I don't want any part of that because I know it's going to fail. So, Harvey, he's an attorney, so he looked at me in the way he does. And he said, okay, but I need a real proposal. Just as you're counseling me not to just appoint a chief diversity officer, I'm counseling you not to just tell me to put a bunch of money behind this. What are you actually going to do? What would this office actually do? So, good question. So, we made a decision at that point to hire an external consultant. We had discovered that several of our Big Ten peers had worked with a consulting firm called Holowani & Associates out of California. So Rona Holowani, it's a very small firm, like 6-7 people, but Rona Holowani, the founder and principal of the organization, has a PhD in issues of diversity and inclusion. Is still a faculty member, but is deeply committed to institutional change in higher education around that. So we decided to hire them to conduct a diversity study of the University of Nebraska. And we're in the midst of that process right now. And they're doing two things. The first thing is that they did a big benchmarking study. So that's the numbers, right, that everybody always does around diversity and inclusion. So they went out, compared us to 5 of our peer institutions: University of Michigan, Michigan State, University of Kansas, University of Iowa, and one more, which I always forget, Indiana. And so they did all the numbers, but it's more than just demographics, though. It was also numbers around, how much does your curriculum embrace diversity and inclusion? So how many courses do you have? How many of those are required? Things like that. And it spanned every aspect of the university, so students, staff, and faculty. And we just got those reports earlier this fall. They're out there released to the campus. You're welcome to read them as well. And now we're in the second phase, which is called the diversity mapping phase, where they're going to come in and document all the efforts from the grassroots efforts, student organizations. We have an African American council that is, grassroots, to things that we're doing to our centers, to our Women's Center, our LGBTQA Center, to the programs that we actually run at the Chancellor or Senior Vice Chancellor's level. To document all that, analyze what's effective, what's not, what are the key features of those things that are effective, what are things that are struggling and why. So that, and that process will finish this spring. And the idea behind that was to give us a baseline to start the next conversation, so that if people want to say we're not doing enough for this group, we can say, well, okay, here's what we are doing, here's what we're not doing, so at least we have a common baseline to have that conversation, rather than people like me making up all these historical facts, right? So we're going to finish that this spring. And then what do we expect to come out of that? So this is being recorded, so now our new Chancellor, Ronnie, will get to see this. I've been telling him this for years, so it's like, at the end of the day, really, we expect two things to come out of this. So one is, we expect the Chancellor's office to lead the campus in a strategic planning exercise around diversity and inclusion that is integrated with the rest of the strategic planning efforts that he has announced. So about a month ago, Chancellor Green announced that we were going to be looking at having task force that look at undergraduate and graduate enrollment, graduation rates, university distinction and reputation, and then what's the fourth one? Excuse me, sorry? Matriculation and success. Thank you. And we're going to ask that diversity and inclusion be the fifth theme in that strategic planning process, so that it doesn't stand by itself. Because when I started my talk, I said, what's the key thing? It's that it has to be everybody's responsibility. That everybody has to be held accountable for diversity and inclusion. In my role as Dean of the College of Engineering, right, I can't just get evaluated based on how much I increase research expenditures, right, how much I increase enrollment. I need to be held accountable for what is the diversity of my student population, both at the undergraduate and graduate level, what's the diversity of my staff, and what's the diversity of my faculty. And if that's not being enacted, then our efforts on diversity and inclusion will fail. Okay. The second thing we expect to come out of this is a request and a proposal for a real Office of Diversity and Inclusion that is separate from our Office of Compliance. So a fully resourced and authorized office whose responsibility will be to work on issues of diversity and inclusion on campus, and will have the authority to hold people like me as Dean of Engineering accountable for those things, to demand of me that I have a strategic plan around diversity and inclusion, and that I'm going to be held accountable for that at the highest level. So I think I've taken more of the time than I was supposed to. That's where we're at. It's complex. The issues of diversity and inclusion in higher ed are very, very complicated by the increasing number of dimensions that come into the questions of diversity and inclusion, by the very different voices you hear on diversity and inclusion, and by political, economic, and cultural realities. And so we really have to take this on in a passionate and sustained way, and not just make it these one-time rallying cries. So I hope that you, as this great group of performing arts centers and this great group of institutions, will do what Bill asked you to do and move forward on diversity and inclusion beyond this wonderful event that you're hosting today. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.